Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Júlia Mir, and I'm working as a bioinformatician in the Quantitative Biology Center in Tübingen and also in NFCore, developing the NFCore tools. And today I'm going to talk about the pipeline parameters validation using a JSON schema that we use in NFCore. So I will start by a brief introduction on Nextflow parameters. Then I will talk about this JSON schema, how we use it, and finally show some ongoing work on a Nextflow plugin. So as you may all know, one of the key features of Nextflow is its ability to use parameters. So you can provide these parameters in a Nextflow config file using the keyword params or in the command line by using the double dashes. And then this will be available in the pipeline, also prepended by the keyword params. So in this basic pipeline example, we have a parameter input that has to be a string because it's a file name. So what would happen if a user provides a value instead of a string? In this case, the pipeline execution starts, and whenever this variable is used, can be at the end, then it will fail because of this error with not a valid path value. In NFCore, we implemented this JSON schema for dealing with parameters, and it allows us to describe data formats, provide documentation, and validate the data. So every NFCore pipeline has a file called nextflow schema.json that looks something like this. And we can specify, for example, the recut parameters, input and out there, and then for each of the parameters, we can provide, for example, the type, and also a pattern using regular expressions, in this case ending by .csv, and also provide some description. So as you can see, this file can be huge and difficult to edit by hand. So we provide this user-friendly command line interface to help you edit this file. In this example, we are adding 2 new parameters in the Nextflow config file. And then we run this command, nfcore schema build. And it will first validate the schema file. Then it will detect these new parameters that we added and ask if we want to add them to the schema file. And then it asks if we want to open a web interface. So let's open this web interface. And here you can see all the parameters that we have in our schema file. And we can edit them. For example, let's create a new group for these new parameters that we just added. You can also, for example, decide if the parameters are required or not by ticking the box in the right. Then for each parameter, those are the new ones, we can define a description. And because we provided some values, we also get the default and the type automatically added. And for example, for strings, you can also provide different options or define patterns using regular expressions. Then when you are happy with editing your file, you can see here a preview of this schema file with the parameters that we just added. So when we finish, we click finish, and the file is edited. So we use this file for many other things, not only inside pipelines, but also outside. For example, this is a screenshot of the RNA-seq page in the NFCore webpage, where the parameter section, the documentation, is automatically generated using this file. We also use it to print the help message when you run a pipeline with the help option. And finally, to actually validate the input parameters. So this is how an NFCore pipeline looks. So we have this lib folder that contains some Groovy code to do different functionalities. One of them, this validation of the inputs. In every NFCore pipeline, in the main.nf file, we add this line of code that adds this function that validates the parameters every time someone executes or runs the pipeline. So finally, I would like to show you some ongoing work that we are doing to port this functionality to a Nextflow plugin. So with this, we are moving beyond not just NF Core, but also so that every Nextflow pipeline can use this plugin to validate the parameters and all these validation that I just talked about with only a few lines of code. So as a demonstration, here we're using, as an example, the RNA-seq pipeline. So let's start by using the help option, and we get a text output of all the possible inputs that we can provide. Okay, then let's run the pipeline. First of all, the first error that we will get is that we don't have an out there parameter, which was required. So it will fail because we have a missing parameter. So let's provide this parameter. If you remember the first example that I showed at the beginning, when we were providing a number instead of a string, let's replicate that. So in this case, because the validation happens before the pipeline execution starts, it fails at the very beginning, not at the end when the pipeline is used. So we get an error with all the variables that fail and the reason. And finally, let's just provide the real out there option, and it validates the parameters. It also prints a summary of the parameters that we use in the pipeline. And finally, the execution will start. Yes. So to show you that it released a few lines of code, this is the code that we added to the pipeline to include these functionalities. So from Paula just talked about that. From the plugin, we can import these 4 functions with an include statement, and then we can use them inside our pipeline. For example, this, the first one that we use is the params help. That is the one that prints the help output. Then validate parameters, that does performs the actual validation of the input. And for example, the last param summary log is the one that prints the summary of parameters that we saw at the beginning of the execution. So if you want to try this plugin, because it's not ready, not yet released, once it's released, if a plugin is included by default in Nextflow, it comes with your installation. If it's not, you can use it in the Nextflow config with the keyword plugin, or by command line also by plugin, and the name and the version. But because it's not ready released, you can try it. It's in this GitHub repo Nextflow IO NF validation. You have here the link. And if you enter there, you will find the instructions. But just as a brief summary, you will need to clone the Nextflow repo and the parameter repo, then just include in your plugin this line include build, then compile the plugin and run your pipeline instead of by the usual Nextflow run using this launch.shell. So yes, you can try this plugin and test it in your pipelines. And that's all from my side. I hope we can have this available for everyone soon. And I would like to end by acknowledging everyone who contributed a lot to all these functionalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Júlia. It's great to see how this works behind the scenes. It's a really nice talk. We've got a couple of questions from the crowd for you. Is there a reason that we use JSON instead of YAML, or is there any plans to support YAML for the schema file?
So by now, we don't support YAML.
Yeah, maybe I can touch on this. There was a discussion about this the other day on Slack where actually I suggested putting it in YAML. And the consensus was that you should never edit this file by hand. So, because we've got nice tools to build it for you. Gisela asks, great talk. Is it possible to perform as well input sample sheet validation?
Yes, so you can also provide a different JSON schema for the sample sheet. Actually, it's used in some of the NF Core pipelines, and you can validate the sample sheet that provides like sample name and all the information required for each sample. But there's not tooling for editing this file in NF Core yet, in NF Core tools.
There's a question here about where is this JSON file kind of stored, and how is it tied together with the pipeline? Where is the JSON file saved?
In the pipeline? So, yeah. So this JSON file is in the pipeline in the main directory, let's say. And the second part of the question? What?
Yeah, so it's in the root of the pipeline itself, so it's stored with the pipeline. Great, I think that's everything. Thank you.
Thank you.